Good evening. My name is Melissa Corbett. I'm with Brooklyn for Peace. Thank you all for coming out tonight to our Middle East Forum. So I just really quickly want to say thank you to our event sponsors. This evening is brought to you by Fort Greene for Peace. It's co-sponsored by the Lafayette Ave Presbyterian Church, Social Justice Committee, Brooklyn for Peace, Peace Action, Bay Ridge Interfaith, Veterans for Peace Chapter 34, New York War Resisters League, Military Family Speak Out New York Chapter. So really quickly before we get started, I'm going to let Ed Moran, who's from the Lafayette Avenue Presbyterian Church, say a few words, welcome us here. I don't know if you can go around.
Thank you.
Okay, Ed Moran.
Thank you. Thank you. My name is Ed Moran. I'm a member of the Lafayette Avenue Presbyterian Church, and I want to bring greetings on behalf of the church. Our interim moderator, Reverend Ann Conroy, wanted me to express her welcome to you. She is unable to be here tonight, but she has a very active interest in Middle Eastern issues, being a board member of the Abraham Fund and other projects working on Middle Eastern reconciliation. And this church has had a long history of social activism and working on behalf of peacemaking. We had we had Children of War, which was housed in our building back in the 1980s and 90s by the late Reverend Paul Mayer, who just died a few months ago. Also, this congregation, the Jarvie family from this congregation, built the YMCA in the city of Jerusalem back in the 1930s with the stipulation that 1/3 of the staff and programming be Jewish, 1/3 Muslim, 1/3 Christian, and to this day it is still a center for peace and reconciliation. But of course, reconciliation depends on justice, and many of us in the church and in other areas are working toward a reconciliation with justice of these issues. So we're very happy to have you here tonight and hope that you will continue to come back in the future. Thank you.
So at this time, I guess I'll welcome our panelists to the front. I believe they're all here. And David WILDMAN, the Executive Secretary for Human Rights and Racial Justice with United Methodist Church General Board of Global Justice.
Great. Well, thank you. It's great to be here. It's been great to hear your presentation so far. I want to touch about the situation in Palestine and Israel, but I also want to just focus on refugees a little bit. So I'll pick up on some of what Maya shared, especially around Syria and Lebanon. I work on behalf of the church, the United Methodist Church, in human rights, and then I also relate to our regional partners. So I go to the Middle East a couple times a year, and I also go to Afghanistan a couple times a year. So part of it is also filtered through the lens of Afghanistan. I know we're not talking about that, but I just want to share that. So I was there in 2006 in Beirut in May. And then I was back again a few months later after the devastating war of Israel against Hezbollah. And I start there because at that point, in 3 weeks, 25% of the Lebanese population fled their homes because of war. And so as someone who's worked on Palestine for many years, and I understood that most folks, when fighting breaks out, are like, I want to get my family to somewhere safe. And it's a temporary thing. And in fact, after the ceasefire, most of the Lebanese were able to return. Their homes may not have been there, but they were back in their villages. They had to worry about cluster bombs. And I share that because I think it was also the chance for me to go to see the refugee camps of Sabra and Shatila, where Palestinian refugees have been since 1948. So they're still waiting for that day of a ceasefire or something that allows them to return. And that kind of pain, and when they fled, thinking that they would go just for a few weeks till the fighting calmed down, has continued for all these years. And for me, that was quite compelling to look at that and just see that contrast. The other contrast I want to share is those of you who were here early enough to see the short video clip of Syria, and I think it's good to remind us of that a lot of war is kind of impersonal. you don't necessarily see who's behind the bombs and behind the snipers. And there's a lot of fighting, but you don't often see the enemy, whoever that is, whatever side you're on, or no sides. But you can see the destruction and the aftermath of it. You destroyed buildings. And that was another reminder in 2006 to see buildings all across southern Beirut that looked exactly like the images there. But they've been rebuilt. And so I think the struggle for Syria now is this 3 years of destruction that has not just destroyed buildings, but destroyed the social fabric of so many communities. So I give that as a little background, and just to say that the urgency of this is really upon us. The UN reported this past week that the number of Syrians displaced went up by 1 million since January. 1 million additional people fled their homes, either to another town or another part of a town, or maybe just even next door, as you saw something, if one part of the building's hit. And so I think that the displacement is continuing, and so that's a challenge for us of what responsibility, what can we do here? So with that kind of background, I want to move to Palestine. I was just there at the beginning of March for about 10 days, mostly in Bethlehem and Jerusalem. And then last October, I was in Gaza for a few days. And the situation in Gaza is this kind of slow burning kind of nightmare. 90% of the water is not drinkable. At the hotel that I was at, I thought, well, at least I can brush my teeth. The water is like a mix of the Mediterranean and a lot of other things I didn't really want to know about. But they literally can't drink anything with bottled water or treated water. With 12 hours or more a day that the electricity is off, the capacity for actually treating water and needing the fuel for that. The only power plant in Gaza runs on diesel fuel. So if there's no import of fuel, then the capacity for the fuel, the power plant, but also the generators that many of the offices, hospitals, and others. So we visited hospitals, and the hospitals were making daily choices of how do we, when the electricity goes off, how many generators do we need running to keep the medicines? Can we plan our surgery around when we think we'll have electricity or not? Those were the daily choices that people were making. And here I want to say that what Zach talked about in however one describes the events in July in Egypt, a coup or military reasserting its authority. I mean, I have friends on different sides that have assessed it as Egyptians in various ways. It did mean for Gaza that almost all the tunnels were closed this summer. And so for a long time, this vice and grip of the Israeli blockade and occupation of surrounding all of Gaza had this little escape valve through Rafah, that the tunnels, everybody kind of knew the tunnels were operating, and that enabled a lot of goods, a lot of food, a lot of fuel to get through at a cheaper price. Now, the Israelis have eased up slightly on what they allow in, but the prices. So the hospital is making that decision of, I used to be able to get a liter of gas for this. Now, there are just exclamation points for now it's 5 or 6 times that price. And so how do we get the funds to keep the hospital running? I went to a workshop for the deaf, where they're vocational training and they're doing crafts. And again, they use power equipment to make wooden things and weaving, and also they need lights. All that goes out. Then they have to decide, do we charge up the generators, or this is just quitting time now? And so there's a lot of day-to-day choices that are not fun. So the key things that are needed for Gaza right now that I think is water, is the aquifer may be is being contaminated because it's been drawn down so much that it may actually be permanently destroyed within 2 years. That it will never be usable again for centuries. So the water crisis in Gaza, which will affect the whole region, the Sinai and southern Israel, the Negev, is a huge problem that could be irreversible. And so it's being caught up in the politics. Second is there has to be fuel that gets in order to, or a capacity and trust to shift the source of fueling for electricity in order to keep basic life going there. And the third is building materials. There's a lot of construction that was able to be done when they were getting things through the tunnels, and now that's kind of stopped. So each time there's destructions, and there is really incursions every week, several times. They're not usually reported in US media that much, but if you follow some of the Palestine websites, human rights websites, you can see these daily attacks. Now I do want to say that just in relation to the extreme numbers that Maya shared about Syria, the overt violence in Palestine now is thankfully nowhere near that. But what I've discovered that's different, and I think people that have worked on this, is the systematic dehumanization of a whole population as being subhuman, simply because of their identity, is the heart of what the UN and the international community condemned when we condemned apartheid. To say, this kind of racism that based solely on one's identity, you do not have rights, and you should be treated differently. And it doesn't matter what you've done or not. That is the part that I think is so compelling about why the situation in Palestine and the Israeli occupation and denial of refugee rights has been around, not only has been around for so long, but affects many, there's a ripple effect in connection to what we've heard in Lebanon, in Syria, and there's like 100,000, 200,000 Palestinian refugees in Syria. There's Palestinian refugees in Lebanon and Jordan, so actually the Palestinians are being doubly or triply displaced. I want to touch on just a couple of things, and then so we can get to the questions as quickly as possible. The apartheid practices are happening every day with active colonialization. I think, when you hear about the settlements, there is no peace process. There is no peace process, except for maybe in the minds of Secretary of State Kerry and a few pundits that make a living by speculating on things that will never happen. And I just want to give a couple things. Do folks remember Annapolis? There was this whole peace process in 2007 in Annapolis, Maryland, and all these leaders from the Middle East, Jordan, and other countries joined with Israel and Palestinian leaders in Annapolis. Well, the Palestine Medical Relief Society did a study of incidences of violence before Annapolis, which is in late November of 2007, and immediately after. The number of instances of Israeli attacks against Palestinians after the peace process started in December 2007 and January 2008 went up exponentially. Exponentially. And this has happened every single time that the U.S. has proposed or said we are going to talk about peace process. And so most Palestinians, when they hear that, are like, well, I better duck, because something's coming my way that's not good. There are going to be night raids. There are going to be detentions. There are going to be missile strikes in the Gaza Strip. There's going to be greater closures in Gaza especially, but also in the West Bank. And the number of shootings, so not missiles, but just, sort of police or Israeli military shooting at close quarters in nonviolent demonstrations, or relatively nonviolent, there's some stones or something, was twice as many in 2013 when we've supposedly been discussing a peace process than in the 2012 or 2011. So it's kind of like peace is not good for the life and health of Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza. I mean, I have to just say that. So that doesn't mean there aren't Palestinians that deeply hope that something can happen. I mean, they are desperate, as we all are. So on that, let me just say, I think most of them are saying, what's going to happen when it fails? or when it's failed. But what happens when they finally say publicly that it's failed? You see the difference? So people can drag out now. There's new terms. We are not going to release prisoners over the weekend, these last couple days, the last installment of prisoners, until the Palestinians, this is the new Israeli demand of the moment, until Palestinians agree to keep talking. Well, every day that Palestinians agree to keep talking, they lose land. They lose homes. They lose trees. They have young people imprisoned. Night raids in the middle of the night, every day. So why should you keep talking? So I will just kind of put out there that my experience has been that 100% of Palestinians practice nonviolent resistance every day as a survival strategy. How do I get through the day? To get to my work through checkpoints, to get to the hospital or a doctor's appointment, to see my family, to go and worship. 100% of Palestinians practice nonviolence as a survival strategy. It's not yet been joined by international efforts. So my sense is always I try and bring nonviolence as something that we should work on here in the US and with the Israelis. Palestinians don't need that. They're in pretty good shape on that front. But seriously, it's like this demonization, again, that plays into this apartheid dynamic, and you talked about that terrorism list of the dualities, of good guys and bad guys, which is very prevalent in US culture. So let me just say on points of things to do, we need to eliminate the State Department's terrorism list of organizations. Because I want to say for two main reasons. One is it shuts off conversations. So if you want a genuine peace process, you should only be talking with folks you don't like, right? I mean, if you're only talking to your friends, it's not a peace process, it's a love fest or something. But it's like, but seriously, you're talking with folks that want to kill you and you don't like them. So if a list says you can't relate to the groups that are on that list, shouldn't that be the list of special priorities for talking with? I mean, not accepting behavior or whatever. We should focus on violence against civilians, which is the definition of civilians, of terrorism, as the problem, not a list of organizations that are identified that way. And the second thing is it's racism. That you lump together all of the people who happen to be members of a political party or a faction or group and say all of them are doing the same things and should be held accountable for the exact same actions. And so I think we really got to stop that. Because the risk here, and I want to wrap up. I always try and put in one text from Scripture. So my apologies to those who don't really like the Bible. I love the Bible. There's some ugly things in there, but there's some really fascinating things. In Psalm 33, the psalmist writes, a king is not saved by his great army, and the war horse is a vain hope for victory, and by its great might it cannot save. Now, the war horse in the psalmist's day, a couple thousand years ago, was the new technology, the quick fix that would win the day in a battle. And they thought, if we have war horses, we can just, take it to them, and we can have the quick fix. Today, the war horse is drones and surgical strikes, and you name it. But you see, it's the same mentality of we have a quick fix. And so we get urgent, and we hear how awful things are in Syria. And so a few months ago, surely we should bomb, because a few missile strikes that even the military said won't do anything will make us feel better. And so I want to challenge that mentality in our political leadership and in the political leadership in the region of the many different political factions. We haven't touched on all of them. That sees somehow a quick fix, that some little gadget is going to take the place of the hard work of negotiating and pressing. And that hard work, I think, is through nonviolent actions, boycott, divestment, and sanctions. And here again, the Palestinian civil society has taken the lead. And what do? And by the way, for Christians, this is Lent. And usually we try and give something up for Lent. And boycotts giving something up. It's like not buying SodaStream. It's not buying Ahava. So boycott is actually, has deeply religious roots there. So I just want to put that out there. And you can see, but seriously, the boycott and divestment and sanctions efforts led by Palestinians that are on the ground in a captive economy where they can't control always what products come in or out, is having a global impact. Netanyahu felt it was so important that he mentioned it 18 times in his speech to AIPAC. Those of us who are activists, how could we get into AIPAC with this message of boycott? Well, Netanyahu, again, I didn't expect him as a colleague, an ally, but there he is, he's mentioning boycotts. And the American Jewish Committee just sent me an action alert saying how to stop BDS. And so to me, I think we need to just celebrate that there are nonviolent efforts on the ground that are really making a tremendous difference, and Palestinians are actually offering an extended Arab Spring of decades, or maybe an Arab season, if you will, of intifada, of shaking off the oppression in varieties of ways. That was not just in the 80s, or not just in the early turn of the century, millennium in 2000s, the second intifada, but it's an ongoing effort that's inviting the rest of us to join them in shaking off this violence, this quick fix, that somehow killing our enemies is a way that really settles things, as opposed to kind of recycling, and so that the displacement and the violence takes place again. And let me end then with, I think that's the challenge before us, is joining these grassroots movements, and they're happening in Syria, Lebanon, and Egypt as well, or using Syria as the next Afghanistan, where all of the outside forces dump weapons into a context that figures that's the way we can solve our domestic problems. Because no one in the US government cares deeply about Syrian people. But they do care about chemical weapons, because if they get in the wrong hands, then those actually might be used elsewhere. So we better bomb about chemical weapons. But when it comes to humanitarian aid, I don't know, we've got to drag our feet, we've got to look at the budget, etc. So that's our challenge, is to kind of join and learn from the Palestinian sisters and brothers, Israelis who've joined that as well, and the international movement of boycott, divestment, and sanctions.
To question and answers. We'll take a quick break. We're going to have Ed, who's from Fort Greene Peace.
So, my question for you is, in this country, we sort of either hear or are led to believe that much of the fighting or ongoing disagreements in all of these countries in the Middle East is the Sunnis fighting the Shias. And they can't agree with each other, and therefore there's chaos. And I'm sort of curious, and on the other hand, I sort of have a sense that they used to intermarry or live in neighborhoods together or something like that. So I'm just wondering, A, how real that is, and B, if it, to what extent is it coming from the bottom up, or is it being instigated by people, groups of people with particular interests?
Just a couple of quick points on that. Thank you. I think that's a good question, because it's beware of any of these binary things that Maya mentioned earlier. So Sunni, Shia, it's not grassroots, although there's nothing like putting the guns in the hands of extremists to exacerbate differences. But I think it's actually a colonial perspective, and that's an identity-based politics of looking for a new enemy, is how that's being framed by the experts. I'm not saying that that's how it's played out on the ground, but in terms of what you asked about the U.S. media and policy analysts, they're describing this really sophisticated thing that they know nothing about. But it's when the British, think about 1948, when British left Palestine, what happens? People who've been living together for centuries can't live together, so we need segregation. When the colonial empire leaves. India, folks have been living together for centuries, millennia, like when the empire leaves, they can't get along. So there must be some kind of ethnic strife or some kind of religious strife. And so the empire has pulled back from Iraq and other things in the Middle East now. They must be fighting. And we need a new enemy, by the way, as the US. And the National Security Strategy paper of 2002, I call it the Gospel of Empire, under the Bush administration, looked at Samuel Huntington's argument and said there's not a clash of civilizations, but a clash within a civilization, a battle for the heart of the Muslim world. And we as the US government must excel in that struggle. And so it was really creating this new enemy that fit with the permanent war. The war on terrorism initially was declared as unended and unendable. And so I think I would just add that to what Maya shared about the specifics.
All right, thank you very much. Okay, so I guess we'll open up the floor now. Does anyone have any questions? I guess we'll go right here, and then you'll got you.
I'm just astonished that Iraqi communists or socialists would be legal now,
I think the other thing I would say is two things on this is I think the new enemy is not, it's like after the Cold War, there's various names for it. Radical Islam, militant Islam, extremist Islamists, that's the new enemy. And it has the Sunni Shia kind of component that was raised in the earlier question. I think the other thing that's masked by that is what Zach was starting to mention earlier, is really the crisis in U.S. militarism. That the U.S. military machine and industrial complex is powerless in the Middle East in terms of actually contributing to constructive change. It can destroy a lot of things, so there's no question it's very powerful in terms of death, but think about Syria. Like, if we bombed, that would not be very helpful. If we didn't bomb, in other words, every military option, boots on the ground, all the different things that kind of experts were spinning out, none of those was going to work. And Iraq showed that the U.S. military, even for all its weapons and all its money, now it's a huge money-making thing, so Congress still sees the power of the military not as a war machine, but as a cash machine for campaigns. And corporations see the military not as a war machine, but as a guaranteed customer with cost-plus profiting. And so if we in the peace movement, I think, need to start claiming that the military-industrial complex has no clothes in terms of what it can do in the Middle East. And that's where we're seeing that the decisions of Iraqis are being done on Iraqi terms, in terms of the Communist Party and the Sunni Shia and the Kurdish involvement, and that's true in the other countries too.
Thank you very much. Yeah, so we'll go ahead and take a few more questions, I guess, group them together, and they can answer them at once. Naomi, do you have a question?
Okay. So Maya, recently I think you wrote an article in which you discussed gender discrimination and violence against women, and how it was playing out in Lebanon, and how it intersected with nationalism and immigrant refugees.
Actually, I would add to that, be very nervous about men who say that if they have more guns, women will be better off.
Right.
I mean, it's just invariably that's not a good equation in my mind. But I want to add to that. I think that to kind of combine these last two questions a little bit about the partition, that right now, the Christians, as a very tiny minority in the Middle East, have often been some of the most ardent exponents of a secular approach. Because they don't want a Muslim state, they don't want Sharia, they don't want a Jewish state in Israel. What they want is a secular state that has citizens' rights. So Egypt for all Egyptians, Syria for all Syrians. Which is why in some cases many of the leadership in churches have actually sided with some of these repressive minority regimes. Like the Assad regime was minorities, so they needed other minorities to kind of develop that, the colonial patronage system that was their kind of version of that once they kind of threw off the old partitions. And I think that it gets played out for me, what I've seen is how the West comes in and takes this notion of gender and gender violence here in the West and imposes it on another context, in relation to the traditional, whatever the version of Sharia or whatever, to say, well, that's a bad way of doing things, when that's been an expression of community resistance as well to the imposition of of the colonial corporatizing. So it's a very mixed kind of thing, and women get used as pawns by the men in political positions of power of almost every stripe. The last thing I'll say about this is in Afghanistan, there were 4 groups of men with guns that advocated on defending women's honor as to why they were doing what they were doing. Including the United States. Well, the United States is the 4th of those. The Soviets were like, women are being mistreated under this kind of Islamic rule. So part of why, of course, the reason we're coming in is not about the Cold War or anything else. It's really to protect women. And there was a degree of women in Kabul and the other cities that had more employment than they did before that in the 70s. Then the Mujahideen were like, these atheist communists are destroying women's honor. We need to restore their honor by putting them back in the home, and we'll go shoot, so we need guns. And then the Taliban were like, the Mujahideen are violating women. So actually the Taliban made the same argument of restoring women's honor. And then of course the US with Laura Bush was like, well, the only reason we're there is because we care about Afghan women. Well, in fact, none of the men with guns have cared seriously, but it's created this confusion then of Western funding that will go to women's groups. So the women's groups should make those decisions themselves, I think. But there's this temptation of money. And in Afghanistan, there's been some really ugly confrontations back and forth between different women's groups around what's going to happen next. And so I think understanding what the local context is a very important part to addressing that.
So I think we have time for maybe one more question. So, okay, David?
I'll try to ask 2 questions.
Okay.
First, the United States gives many billions of dollars a year to the Egyptian military. And I'm wondering, in light of the coup, whether there's any sense that any of you have that that there may actually be some opposition to that may be useful, and something that we in Brooklyn might want to participate in. My second question is more generally, there's an association with U.S. intelligence activities and drug running. And I'm wondering if that is in fact going on in places like Syria and Lebanon at this point as a way of funding some of the groups that the United States would like to see funded. So.
But I think when you talk about drugs, you always need to talk about weapons as well, and arms running, not just. So gun running is closely connected with drug running in almost every instance. I mean, it's also in inner cities across the United States as well, of how do you kind of justify a large police presence or military presence is institutionalized chaos. I've got one funny little quote. If you remember the 1968, the Democratic Convention in Chicago, and there was a police riot, and the police chief was, I forget his name now, but was confronted about that, and he said, no, the job of the police is not to create disorder, it's to preserve disorder. And I actually think that that was quite accurate, although it was a slip of the tongue on his part, of that one of the roles of a colonial power, of an empire, is to preserve disorder that keeps weakness. And drugs is a great way to do that, and flooding the place with guns is a great way to do that. So with all that oil under the ground, you want to make sure you have really weak regimes across the region from a kind of a Western standpoint. And so I think that, like, always asking about the drugs and the links with guns, because they generate a lot of cash with no receipts. And the U.S. has shown that they are now, the U.S. military is experts in providing billions of dollars in cash with no receipts in Afghanistan and Iraq. So yeah, it's hard to track. So that's why you can't really say until you really get someone in that network. And I'll also just say that Israel is one of the largest arms exporters in the world. And so its involvement with militias and conflicts across the continent of Africa is deep in terms of providing guns and weapons. Almost every single conflict in the Democratic Republic of Congo, in Sierra Leone, in Liberia, in Southern Africa, there are Israeli arms dealers, not necessarily the Israeli government, but Israeli arms dealers, because that's such a big part of their own economy, just as it's such a big part of the U.S. economy.
All right, thank you very much. So I think we're just about out of time. So I guess we'll say thank you to our panelists. And that